So, good evening, everybody. My name's Quentin Compton Bishop. I'm the chairman of the Levantine Heritage Foundation. And also with us, Craig Enser, our founder and general secretary. And just to thank him for organising this series of events. We try to hold around 2 Zoom events a month on average. It may sort of ease back a bit over the summer. Just to, before we get started with the talk this evening, just to mention our next talk, which is in about a month's time, the characters of Yusuf Franco, an Ottoman bureaucrat's caricatures. Now this is based on an exhibition and a book about a series of caricatures put together by an Ottoman bureaucrat in the sort of latter part of the 19th century. And we have 2 speakers, Dr. Mehmet Kentel and Dr. Özge Ertem, the curator and editor of the exhibition and the book, who will be speaking to us on the 23rd of June. Please do register for that. Thank you everybody who has joined us for the first time. These talks are free to members, and those who aren't members have paid £5 towards it. This money all goes to help maintain our website and the support that we give our members. And to those who are not members, we would be very happy if after this talk you'd like to become a member, to credit you with the £5 that you paid and put that towards your membership. Do get in touch with me or Craig if you would like to do that. Now I'll go straight on to introduce Dr. Malte Fuhrmann and his talk. Dr. Fuhrmann is a research fellow at Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient, or ZMO, which is a specialist research foundation specializing in Muslim societies and their relationship with neighboring non-Muslim regions. So we're very fortunate to have a specialist from a specialist institution speaking to us this evening. Dr. Fuhrmann has been doing many years of research and teaching in Istanbul. He is the author of various books, including Constantinople, Istanbul, Stadt der Sultane und Rebellen in 2019, Der Traum vom Deutschen Orient, Zwei deutsche Kolonien in Osmanische Reich, 1850 to 1918 in 2006, and co-editor of The City in the Ottoman Empire, Migration and the Making of Urban Modernity, with Ulrike Freitag, Nora Laffy, and Florian Riedler, I think, who are colleagues or associates of ZMO. He's currently working on a German Research Foundation funded project on the evolution of developmental discourse in Bulgaria and Turkey in the debate on traffic infrastructure. So a different take on the interconnections in the region. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand over to Malte and welcome. We very much look forward to your talk.
Yes, thank you.
Actually, Malte, if I may just quickly add, I meant to say we will have questions after your talk. And for those that would like to ask a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom function or turn your video on and wave at me, or put a question in the chat and I will pick it up and ask it in order. So sorry about that, Malte, over to you.
Yes, Well, thank you, Quentin, especially for faithfully working through all my German book titles in perfect reading. Um, Also, thank you very much on the one hand to Eleni Sentimente, who helped me put together the visuals of this presentation, and obviously to everyone who's inspired me and helped me in my work over the years, which have gone into this book, such as Philip Mansell or Paolo Girardelli, whom I have seen in the audience so far. So what I'm talking about is basically this book, which was just mentioned, Port Cities of the Eastern Mediterranean Urban Culture in the Late Ottoman Empire, came out a few months ago. Port Cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's somewhat of a presumptuous title. I'm not claiming that I'm the only one writing about urban culture of the Eastern Mediterranean, that I'm the first one to do so. In fact, this book has very much profited from discussions with other scholars and from their writings, as I said, Paolo, Philip, and plenty of others. And not to forget the Levantine Heritage website, which has helped to fill some holes in documentation. Thank you very much. But as you know, publishers don't like too flowery titles. They prefer something straightforward. My publishers pushed for this one, and I accepted it. So I would claim that this is a book about the port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, not the first one, and hopefully not the ultimate one. Nonetheless, I hope that my book can take our field of specialty one step further. When looking for textbook works on modern Turkey, Greece, Southeast Europe, or the Middle East, people do not turn to the urban historians of the Eastern Mediterranean. In part, this phenomenon has a long history in itself. However, I would claim that this is also to some degree our faults. The way we portray our findings, they often do not speak to the big discussions people have about these countries and the region. But if you look at a photograph like this one, taken sometime around the end of the 19th century on the quays of Izmir, you will see these pedestrians here in the center. What can we say just by looking at them? If you have the picture in front of you enlarged, you can see these two men here with their backs turned to us. They're dressed in baggy pants, they're wearing white coats, have thick kerchiefs around their fezzes. Overall, one would call this kind of dress traditional. You have, on the other hand, this person here walking towards us who is dressed in a perfect Western suit. You could say, okay, it's a clash of culture, almost a collision course between them. However, there's this older man, there's this older man walking next to them who manages to blend, for example, the lengthy coat and the fez with Western style trousers. You have even further to the right on the screen, this other person with very tightly tailored suit, very short beard, plus once again, fez. It is not so much for the modern or against the modern how these people decide to dress. In fact, they chose various blends of attire to express themselves. What about Salonika? Now this is 1917, when it is actually not an Ottoman town anymore. As you can see, the residents stayed up to date with developments in architecture, such as the recent Art Nouveau style. You find the Olympia Cinema built according to this style. And what do people actually go to see? If you can read the billboards of the movies, these people are lining up for, one is in French, L'Homme qui assassina, a French movie where the story actually takes place in Istanbul. That is why you can see on this billboard, once again, a man with a fez. Also, there is an American movie, Hearts of the West. Although this is occupied Salonika in 1917, you do not actually see many French or British soldiers in the audience here. You see a lot of people dressed in civil clothes, actually. You see a lot of women, and in particular, if you're wondering what these little white spots here are, you see a lot of schoolgirls with their white bonnets sticking out of the crowd. So one can learn from this picture that these people still have a lot of interest in topics centered around Istanbul. They easily deal with English or French films as they are part of their world. And to be honest, I zoomed into these pictures privately. Don't think that I have such perfect 120% vision, to be honest. Especially when it comes to this picture where you can observe some either more minute details, which will probably not come across in unless you have a big magnification of what you see. So early 20th century Istanbul. You see more adventures into modern architecture, the prominent building still standing until today of the Wiener Bankenverein in Art Nouveau. This mosque, which was demolished later with its experimental shape. If you look to the right of the screen, you will see advertisement not only in French Latin letters, but also in Ottoman Arabic, Cyrillic, and Armenian writing. Here to the other side, and that's where it becomes a bit obscure, you might faintly make out advertisement in Latin and Greek letters. To sum up, these were highly diverse places. Yet strangely, for a present-day inhabitant of this region, these pictures look rather exotic. Someone born in late 20th or early 21st century Greece or Turkey would look at them differently than someone gazing at an old photograph of Piccadilly Circus, Unter den Linden, or Champs-Élysées. They would not be in the center of a history book on Turkey, Southeast Europe, or the like. They are relegated to our slightly exotic field of the history of Ottoman cities. As I had said, this is in part due to historiography. You could trace this neglect all the way to Karl Marx, to Max Weber, from whom I have a quote here, past Bernard Lewis or Immanuel Wallerstein. The general idea they share is that cities outside of Europe are not very interesting. This is based on the belief that both the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole were agricultural societies. Therefore, historians do not have to concern themselves with these cities. Strictly speaking, if you read this quote, they are boring. But I would say this attitude is something we have to counter. This is not just an academic question, because this attitude continues to inform the opinions people have about these cities until today, and societies or states in general. So in order to do that, we have to tackle the more classic issues, the big questions of the modern history of the region. And one of them is Europeanization. That is the question whether this region in the 19th century started to change substantially under the influence of its Western neighbors, and what exactly the nature of this change was. When deciding to tackle this question, I was asking myself, what can I do differently in dealing with these questions as an urban and cultural historian? On the one hand, I obviously choose different phenomena to analyze. But apart from that, I selected a few frameworks in order to make sure that I have a different perspective. One of the frameworks is definitely the city. I don't want to write a history of the Ottoman Empire, nor, of course, there is Ottoman Empire in my book, that's not a question, but I take the city seriously as a space, an urban arena in which the exact form of what Europeanization would look like is contested, experimented with, perhaps discarded, perhaps transformed in the process. In order to do this, it is important to take the people in the city seriously as agents, no matter what nationality or ethnic identity they had. This is not simply out of political correctness. It is about trying to understand the particular culture that was created in this period, trying to understand it without a priori dividing the urban residents into Greeks, Armenians, and the like. Because more often than not, the experience of the urban space is not that different from community to community. It is also to allow several residents who do not have Ottoman nationality to be seen as part of this urban culture. They were important for it, as I could tell from my work, especially with Habsburg consular material. Second, Europe or Europeanization is on the one hand the object of my study, but is also one of the perspectives. A lot of people in this time considered the Eastern Mediterranean, or at least their respective city, a corner of Europe, as one contemporary writer, Refi Khalid Karay, wrote. You could find a number of other quotes with roughly the same meaning from this period from the press or other places. But what difference does that make? We tend to frame the Ottoman Empire as the antithesis of Europe, as the Orient facing the Occident. But I think that in many ways, we can actually learn more by interpreting some of the social phenomena we see as part of some wider trans-European continuity. I don't want to claim that there were no differences between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe. However, the study of Portugal, Ireland, or what have you would also lead the historian to concede differences here or there. Also, at least on a theoretical level, we are anyways beyond the point that we claim there's a singular model of European development. Third, I try to take the Mediterranean dimension in this seriously. The sea is, and now I quote, a space of asymmetric relationships and shared experiences among Europe, the Maghreb, and the Middle East. That is a literal quote from Manuel Boruta and Sakis Gekas. In addition, my sources are a rather liberal mix of different types, sources relating to different social strata, to actions, and the written word. The book is organized, as you can see here, according to different sections on space, entertainment, and identities, and also how this particular culture came to an end. I will try to skim briefly over it and perhaps focus a little bit more on the aspect of identities. So first, to the question of space in the more narrow sense of the word. The imagined and the constructed space of the Mediterranean cities. What was it determined by? To begin with, the Mediterranean dimension. In 1798, the Napoleonic forces defeated the Ottoman ones in Egypt rather easily. As of this time, it is common knowledge that the Ottomans are not a naval power anymore. They could be forced to relinquish their part of the Mediterranean. However, as we all know, this does not happen immediately. For over 100 years, this region remains by and large Ottoman, a few colonies and breakaway states on Ottoman soil notwithstanding. However, the state is no longer the dominant power. When it comes to conceptualizing this region's fate, what its future holds, it becomes apparent that you do not have a new single power. Instead, you have several great powers which try to balance each other out. That is, of course, not a new insight. But the question I try to answer is, what impact does that have on the level of ideology? How is this ideological gap filled once Pax Ottomana has come to an end? I found that its place is taken by something I call the European dream. From Napoleon's landing in Egypt, past other initiatives by the French embassy in Constantinople in this period, until the eve of World War I, in different ways, people repeated, reiterated, reformulated promise to the population of the Ottoman Empire, namely that there is a wider world out there the Ottomans could be a part of, a community of cultured nations, as the scholar Martin Hartmann calls it. The slide shows a few random expressions of this promise around 1860. I find it important to state that this is something different than the white man's burden or other expressions of civilizing missions. It is the claim that the Eastern Mediterranean population could be among the winners of 19th century processes of change. The condition is performance, that the locals should engage with commerce, adapt the cultural fashions emanating out of Western Europe. That is the message the European dream brings across. It's very debatable when in history and by whom this was ever meant genuinely, and at what times such claims were rather meant to pacify the locals, and this need not be resolved in every detail. What is more important to remember, the locals seized upon this vision and acted upon it. We see among these quotes, for example, Mehmet Reşit Pasha, a governor of Aydın at the time. However, it was not even limited to the elites who embraced the European dream. You will also find middle-class locals expressing their support. Europeanization was not only undertaken to be recognized as equals by foreigners, it was also a tool to process change in a way allowing for the residents to live in the cities according to their own desires. One aspect where you can see a solidification of this idea is the quest for a beautiful urban space. So part of the desire for Europeanization touched upon the question how the cities should look. People at the time were rather unhappy with the waterfront image of their cities. As you can see here, in 1860s Smyrna, these ramshackle warehouses are not the best postcard image a city could hope for. There were long debates in this period about the rebuilding of the quays. There were obviously material and state interests to change the situation, but they were also the result of an initiative for beautification of the cities. After some long struggles I will not go into here, the seafront has actually changed according to modern norms of regularity, symmetry, beauty, and efficiency of transport. From these new spaces, new sociabilities evolved. One of the main activities was the corso or volta, which meant to get dressed up in chic attire, going up and down the waterfront at sunset, which still exists in an activity which still exists in some Mediterranean countries until today. The topic of sociability leads me to the second section on entertainment. While many activities in some form already existed, especially among foreigners from overseas, several expressions of culture expanded and were now enjoyed by a larger section of the local population. I will only briefly touch on them as I have talked about them in other presentations. Society balls are important events in all of these cities throughout the period. Theater in general, but especially opera, becomes an obsession. I speak in the book of Opera Mania. As Adam Mestian has already described in his PhD thesis, from about the 1830s onwards, this precipitates a huge exchange meaning artists, musicians, stage builders, who are actually traveling from Italy or France and other more distant places in order to meet the Ottoman demand for opera. And here another shot from Smyrna and the respective theater there. Another commodity I wish to mention is beer. Hardly known around the Eastern Mediterranean at the beginning of the 19th century, it becomes at least the second most popular drink of the region. This, on the one hand, brings forth upscale sites of entertainment, as we see here, the Viennese beer house in Pera, Constantinople, known also by its owner's name as Yannis. But also, beer produced other sites of socialization, which are not necessarily as upper class, nor as old, nor as male, as in the previous picture, as one can see here in this beer garden. Beer, just as taking part in balls or visiting the opera, was a possibility for people to show their openness to change on the one hand, but also their cultural capital. Especially the balls were opportunities to perform interethnic harmony. Also, the 19th century European forms of entertainment offered new possibilities for intergender sociabilities. So now to quickly move on to the topic of identities, which is obviously one of the central issues in 19th century history of the Mediterranean. First of all, I would like to play a short extract from a song, which I find helpful for understanding the particularities of identities in this period. And if you'll briefly excuse me, I have to exit the slide format for that. All right. So go back to the full screen. Right. So what's this song about? You have to imagine the streets of Smyrna before the Great Fire of 1922. A man approaches a woman and asks her, "Are you Turkish? Are you Greek? Or are you English? You are so beautiful." Wait a minute, just have to quickly change one more thing here. Forgot to switch off. Okay, here I'm back. So a man approaches a woman on the streets of Smyrna and says, like, "Are you Turkish? Are you Greek? Or are you English or French? You are so beautiful." And after such an aggressive pass, the woman must, of course, in some way put the guy back into his place. So she says, "What is it to you whether I live in Menemen or Cordelio?" These are two different suburbs or neighboring towns of Izmir. "And I will wear my shalvar." Most of you know shalvar is the traditional baggy pants of Anatolia. "I will wear them any color I like." So why are we dealing with a song which was perhaps sung in some bars back then when trying to assess identities on the Eastern Mediterranean shores? I find it significant because it stresses the aspect of ambivalence. The man begins by asking about the ethnicity of the woman he is attracted to. However, he never manages to actually make her commit to the one or the other. Also, we don't know whether this woman really wants to get rid of her admirer, or simply wards him off to defend her public image. All of these things, including identifying with nationality or local suburbs, are in flux in this song. This is something I believe to be particular to this period and most especially to these kind of cities. Looking for other examples of more fluid identity, I found a number of names in Protestant and Catholic baptism registers in these cities from the beginning of the 20th century. And before somebody calls me out, the first one, though, is actually from the Levantine Heritage website. Thank you for the group of people who entered the story of the family of Prokop there. So you can see that at least some people have started to mix and to give their children Italian and Arabic names, or a German and a Greek name, or German and Turkish, as in the last two examples. This goes to show that there are people who identify positively with mixed cultures and identities. Is this a topic which I just discovered? No, of course not. I could definitely not claim so. This has been reflected upon a lot, actually, both in contemporary literature and in later writings. Sheriff Mardin draws our attention to the novel Araba Sevdası, Love of Carriages, by Recaizade Mahmud Ekrem, which was first published in 1896. He sees in the main character Bihruz Bey an example of a condition contemporaries see as a malaise, a feeling of unease or things being out of place. What is this Bihruz Bey syndrome? It is described as a form of arrested development between East and West, old and new, modern and unmodern. For example, Bihruz Bey, in order to attract the attention of the woman he adores, tries to translate first Persian poetry, then French poetry. He manages neither. None of them come out right. He has a high interest in material things. Modern dress, the canes, the coats he wears. He despises the simple rural people of his times. This is a character default Mahmud Ekrem wanted to draw attention to, which you can find in other examples of the literature. However, while I think that Sheriff Mardin's observations are absolutely correct, I think that we can take this a step further. If we try to see this not as a phenomenon of Easterners facing the West, but rather of a situation which reflects to some part what people were going through all over Europe, if not all over the world at the time. In this context, I found this quote by Moritz Czaki, as well as his general writings, very helpful. Czaki reflects here on the Habsburg cities in the 19th century as multicultural sites. He draws on the writings of several contemporary authors to understand this feeling people had of in-betweenness or lack of qualities. Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities is the stereotypical character in these writings. People were bombarded by different possibilities the modern world offers them, but in the end, never really manage to act upon the possibilities which they are confronted with. Instead, as you can see in this comic book version of Robert Musil's Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, Ulrich, the main character, lies in bed and fantasizes about things in the world based upon his readings. So this is something I find rather helpful, to look at some German language authors to understand things which also affected people in the urban centers around the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the writers I found particularly helpful is Friedrich Nietzsche. If you look at this short passage, I think what he describes is something similar to what Bihruz Bey and the Man Without Qualities experienced in later decades. The sensation that there are so many different morals, different arts, different aspects bombarding the individual that he or she is no longer able to act upon them. Even if there are great changes in your time, you end up contemplating things and not taking part in them. So what do you do if you're afflicted by this malaise, the Bihruz Bey syndrome, or have become a person without qualities? Friedrich Nietzsche's suggestion runs somewhat like this. cannot take this this transitional period we live in seriously. But what we can do is try to make the most of those freedoms we have. The fact that everything is in flux, that things one day are attached to certain values, which have disappeared the next day. Yeah, the message is go out there and enjoy it as much as you can. And that is what I see actually expressed in that song by Muammer Kitenjoğlu, which I played earlier. Are there more examples of the Mediterranean port city residents framing their experience of the modern world in a similar vein to Nietzsche? Yes, I'd say there are plenty. One very interesting discussion I found in the Journal de Salonique in a series of letters to the editor from 1895 into 1896. What were turn of the century Salonika residents discussing in this French language newspaper? The quality of men and women of Salonika. The discussion is kicked off by the editor-in-chief Vitalis Cohen, writing under his pen name of Sheridan. He describes the young unmarried women as the 11th plague Moses forgot to smite Egypt with, showing all their unfulfilled dreams and suppressed desires for a husband. At the end of this lengthy, very sexist satire, what does he suggest to do? Since there are so many brunettes in this town, one might as well send them off to the Mormons in Salt Lake City, because the Mormons can have 50 wives, and this way Salonika could be rid of them. Already then, media professionals such as Vitalis Cohen knew that provocation will get you readers, and retorts will get you to be the talk of the town. Nonetheless, I believe even the editor of the paper was surprised about the number of letters on the subject that continued to pour in over weeks and weeks. The next issue, we have a letter to the editor by a young lady, as her pseudonym goes. She retorts by heading into the opposite direction, saying, if we, as the young women of Salonika, take so long to inspect what is to be had on the marriage bazaar, it is because we find very few suitable candidates. This is a city of commerce. These men never talk about anything but their business. They do not exercise their bodies. They do not exercise their minds. There's no intellectual, poetic, idealist activity. When we have to dance with them, they tire easily and do not know how to dance because they have never bothered to learn. Therefore, the overall interest in Salonika men is low. Next, a male writer pitches in, claiming, yes, it is true. Our city is nothing but commerce. Therefore, life is difficult. He even uses the Darwinian phrase, struggle for life, in the English original. How could we exercise our bodies when we can't even ride a bicycle in this town because it would get stuck in the mud, as there are no properly paved streets? Next, another man writes, saying, what is the charm in these women anymore? These days, everyone has a piano, and even the servant personnel dresses as if they are baronesses. He therefore has decided to enjoy his bachelor life a little longer, but accepts that he should, in this case, help his mother and sister with the household. What can we read from this very quaint, very middle-class discussion? I think this is a straightforward negotiation of contemporary gender roles. It shows that port city residents were unhappy with their ascribed roles, but as becomes apparent, they do not manage to take any decisive step to make the most out of what they have been reading about in their French novels, in newspapers, which are supposedly a window onto the wider world. Just as Robert Muse's Man Without Qualities, they end up just contemplating on the possibilities of the modern world, still hoping that someday the knight in shining armor or the femme fatale will appear, grab them by the hand, and take them out of this conceited, stagnant Salonika in order to lead them to the promises of the modern world. So in a very different genre, this is also a reflection on a malaise, What strikes me is that it does not come out of the advice literature of the late Ottoman period, which has been thoroughly studied in recent years. Instead, this is something resulting from everyday life experiences and described by people intimately affected by them. I look at some other publications to answer the question, when in this period do people actually experience this feeling of inadequacy, and when do people actually manage to overcome it and get a sense that they, according to Nietzsche's expression, manage to live in the light, making the most of this weird transitional period they live in. There are actually several outlets, it seems. Katja Jana lists cross-dressing as one of them, not dressing perfectly Ottoman, not perfectly Western, but coming up with these weird in-between combinations, as we saw in the first slide of the Smyrna keys. Seçil Yılmaz gives us the example of how a doctor finds medicinal discourse an excuse to speak out openly about sexual intercourse in bourgeois society. Murat Yildiz has used gymnasts as an example of people who broke out of their prescribed gender roles, and this list could be greatly extended. However, there are a lot of discourses in this period, usually tied to nation-building projects or to the concomitant project of creating a national bourgeoisie as a community of sentiment following certain rules. Within these projects, people are instructed to stay away from what is considered excesses, the too liberal spirit of the age. I see this trope of literature as standing against the free-spirited, free-minded way of dealing with the modern world. The gist of the argumentation usually reads, yes, we might need modern math and foreign languages, but on the other hand, we need to focus on our community, on family values and the like. I do not have time to go into it any further, but I think a number of you will know the kind of literature I'm referring to. The last major section of the book deals with the disintegration of this particular era, during which the urban culture I've tried to sketch here came to bloom, by on the one hand anti-European discourses, but also by a type of angry young men and women, which Pankaj Mishra speaks about in his Age of Anger. This was for me a very helpful way to address the unraveling of the port cities and the subsequent nationalization of urban space, which you see two examples of here on the Izmir and Salonika waterfront, that is in the center of two port cities. So to sum up, this process of Europeanization was not just a matter of conscious political decision-making by the Sultan, his elite bureaucracy, or later by political parties. It was an organic process that influenced the culture and the lives of millions, and influenced such everyday questions as what to wear, how to lead a conversation, how to spend leisure time, and what qualities to look for in a potential marriage partner. Within this process, it was less the question of making a conscious choice for or against a set toolbox to install modernity, which was waiting there with the instruction manual attached to sort of use a caricature of how we now look at modernization theory. Modernity was still an ongoing project, and the residents of the port cities decided to jump aboard, believing that it could prove helpful, not only to end up among the winners of the New World Order, but also to fulfill their desires for the urban space, for pleasure, and identity building. The European dream or promise of joining a world on the move was not a coherent policy, but a result of the gap between an Ottoman imperial center that no longer managed to integrate its subjects into a common imperial narrative of legitimacy, and on the other hand, of the influence of other European countries. These were most of the time present in the late Ottoman sphere more through schools, immigrants, novels, or leisure activities such as having a beer or visiting the opera than through direct political control. However, the psychic tensions of existing in a space exposed to the multiple possibilities of the modern world without a strong state to identify with precipitated counter-discourses to rein in the ongoing free experiments and ultimately the rise of a group of angry young men and women who played an important role in finally seeing the cities they were born in and their cultural order go up in flames. This is but one contribution that illustrates how the fields of urban and cultural history can lead to more nuanced perceptions of processes that are usually addressed in the framework of political history. Thank you. That is what I wanted to talk about here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Malte. We'll now move on to questions. So if you just do a gallery view so I can see people, would anyone like to lead with a question to Malte? If I can start with one, to what extent did these three cities, was there a model that they aspired to in any sense? You know, did they want to be Paris? And I suppose the other side of that is, what did European cities think of the three cities?
Mm-hmm. Right. So a lot of this, especially when it comes to changing the urban fabric, actually reconstructing these cities, tearing old streets down because they're considered too narrow or too not representative enough. A lot of that goes through always talking about other places. As you guessed, Paris is the place everybody refers to. Paris sticks out, definitely. One could almost call it like a mythical Paris. I don't think it often actually refers so much to very specific things. Marseille to some degree, because a lot of these people who are discussing this actively actually travel and arrive in this great model, France, first in Marseille. That also plays a role. And to the other part of your question, yes, reconstructing the cities is often about trying to also impress travelers, especially coming from these European core or model countries, Germany, France, Great Britain. So not surprisingly, the serious reconstruction of these cities, at least in Izmir and Salonika, starts with the quays. That's the key key thing which is changed first. There's a practical reason. There's the reason that people want to go in the evening for a walk, but it is also about trying to show off, to have like a postcard image of their city. And this works sort of both ways. Some, especially people who don't stay in these cities long, who are sort of on a tour of the Levant, they'll descend from their ship and say like, oh yeah, this looks kind of nice. Especially, I don't know, I was last docked in Palestine compared to this, to that, or another traveler compares it to Antalya at the time. They're all like, oh yeah, this is urban life, we're sort of back. But then there is also, especially as the modernization of these cities progresses, travelers who are actually looking for the exotic, and they kind of feel disappointed. They're sort of like, where can I find something? And they'll go into, especially in Salonika, into the upper hills of the town where they can still find like the old Turkish quarters, and there they'll take photographs or write poems about these streets. So you have kind of a divide of this, an inner divide of the city, because at no point in the 19th century does somebody say like, okay, modernization is over, this is Europe 100%. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Paolo Girardelli.
Paolo, we don't hear you. Okay.
Hi, Malte. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm sorry I'm not showing my room because it's too messy, but so anyway, I was especially interested in your analysis of names, so given names, and how they witness a desire of accepting or even promoting, I don't know, this identity in flux and this being in between. So I think it's an interesting, one should do, really study genealogies and names systematically, really, to understand this aspect of the Levantine identity. But I was also wondering about the opposite trend. So did you find in the inhabitants of these cities also the desire of appearing purely Italian, purely French, of forgetting this hybrid or complex background?
Hard to say. I'm sure. Obviously, there were trends going on at the time. You have, for example, I couldn't say that it reflects on the practice of name giving so much. Obviously, we have these names which reflect some kind of, you might say, indigenization, like Baltazzi coming from Baltage originally. So you have these kind of transitions which tend to sort of pass over actually the foreign origins of names. There's that, of course. You have it definitely with like in the question what languages do you see on the street or in public in general? There's a prior to World War I, there's a fight in Izmir over subtitling of movies. Actually, as I was trying to show in that slide, people are getting, they don't bother anymore. They just go to see the Italian movie or, the French or English language movie, and I don't know, subtitling had actually been dropped as a practice which keeps up the process of releasing a movie too long. But then there are these demonstrations that there have to be Ottoman Turkish subtitles as part of this kind of trying to eradicate the multilingual or this multilingual approach many of the people in these cities had. These are just a few ideas off the top of my head popping up. Obviously, later on, the nation states, once they were in official control of these cities, helped the process along, stopped the naming of streets in several languages, enforced the use of Istanbul for what was Constantinople, Kushta, the Poli, whatever before that. But I think that most people here know. So just a few ideas off the top of my head. I guess I should think about that question a little bit longer.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. James Bone.
Hi there. I'm interested in any parallels you see between this period you're studying, which was a period of great globalization about to hit a brick wall of deglobalization, with the period that we're in now, several of the things you were saying made me think of our contemporary vocabulary about our own period. I mean, you talked about the malaise, you talked about the rapid transition, you talked about the people trying to join the modern world in the way that we talk about the haves and have-nots and people wanting to join the haves, and we talk about the left behinds. And I wonder whether you recognize in our current period of rapid deglobalization any of the cultural phenomena that you're familiar with from the period that you are studying in that in the end of the 19th century.
Thank you for bringing that up. In fact, I deal with this in the epilogue of my book. I try to say that rather bluntly. Yes, I am to some degree reflecting processes which are happening around me at the time of writing onto a past era, which one could, in like an old historiographic tradition, one would have criticized that for like not being free of the inspirations of our present time. But I think nowadays we sort of see like what can we gain by sort of seeing like what is different in our period compared to say the 1970s or so, which might help us to understand the Belle Époque or the 19th century in ways which a person from the 1970s could not have or would not have most likely. So this book is the culmination of almost 15 years of research. So when I started writing, we were in the period of Europhoria. Greece introduced the euro, people were happy in this boost of buying power people had. In Turkey, the talks about joining the EU had just kicked in. So this whole region was in this spirit. Yes, we can be, if we work hard enough, we can be part of this bigger picture. We can be there. And by the time of the Balkan Wars, this feeling had gone. And likewise, we live obviously in a period where at least in Britain, 50 points, I don't know how many people no longer believe it to be a good idea to be part of the European Union, or thought that a couple of years ago at least. Likewise, in Turkey, there's a nationalist rejection of the Europeanization process by many people, and there's political capital to keep a government in power based on that. Likewise, in Greece, people have realized that, well, the euro actually did not work out well to economically for the largest number of Greek citizens. So there is very much these parallels, which I definitely see here. And of course, there's a question, can we sort of learn from these port cities about trying to form a cosmopolitan society nowadays in our cities, which are becoming more mixed from year to year as well. That is something where I'd say in the 90s, when port city studies initially were a rather new phenomenon still, there was a sort of naive reading, people called it, or a celebratory reading, I think one author called it, to say like, hey, people in Izmir 100 years ago, they managed to live with 6 different widespread languages and different religions and denominations. We can do it in 1990s, say, Munich as well. Nowadays, of course, we're a lot more careful. On the one hand, once again, a reflection of our zeitgeist, But on the other hand, also because we have been more in-depth studying these cities, knowing that it was not like a culture of tolerance which everybody shared. It was sort of powers, as I tried to sketch it, the political powers at work in these cities sort of balanced each other's out, and for lack of any clear dominant culture, people were polite about it. People were nice. People said like, oh yeah, sure, Catholics here, Christian Orthodox, Sabbatais, whoever, Sabbateans, whoever, why not? And people, yes, some people did draw a positive energy out of this, liked it, at least as long as they couldn't have something else. Other people actively worked on its destruction and got the upper hand eventually, unfortunately for us. And the question is, I think, like, will we end up the same? Will we have some cataclysmic thing like the fire of Izmir 1922? Or is maybe our section of society, which is in favor of somehow trying to create a society where you can live with different languages and different religion without one side having to be on top and the other beneath. Is this part of society perhaps more resilient nowadays than it was back then? And I'm trying to sort of hold on to that hope, put it that way.
One of the things that struck me in your talk was the way that the project or the idea of modernization was linked up to mercantilism. Really, it wasn't really in the way at the moment. Now it's post World War II. It's a political project, right? But it was driven, as globalization is in our generations, by mercantilism, really, and didn't really give a very firm basis for the people who weren't benefiting from it. And by studying the port cities, you're kind of studying a distorted sample, because, I mean, the people who don't benefit are the people of the interior, right? So that's the problem. It's not so much the port cities, it's the people of the interior. And that's the problem today. I mean, if you look at the map of America, the Trump voters don't live on the coasts, right?
Interestingly, talking about voters, people have superimposed the regions of Turkey which do not vote for the AKP onto ethnic maps of the Ottoman Empire. And they kind of found like people living in regions which used to have a strong Greek population or non-Muslim population. That's the same places where nowadays people, even though that population is gone, that's the same region, mostly Western Anatolia, which has a strong turnout against the AKP and for Republicans, the Republican People's Party of Turkey, that is. I'd say like partially you're right. However, I try to avoid a oversimplified contrast between the hinterland and the port cities, because port city economy is not an economy which produces things in itself. Basically, there's not much which these cities actually produce. They're basically intermediates between agriculture production in the hinterland. So if you look at the global market, so if you look at what is being put on those steamships out of Izmir in the 19th century, you'll find carpets made upcountry, dried fruits which might have been dried in town, but which were originally grown upcountry, cotton, opium, Valonia, a dye used in textile industry in the 19th century. All of that comes from, not from super far away, but from within a couple of 100 kilometers into the hinterland. And that also means merchants from Izmir travel into the hinterland to Uşak, Afyon, God knows where, these people come from those places to negotiate with the merchants in town. There's an exchange, and that exchange is not simply just you give me this, pay this and that. There is conviviality. There are ways of interaction. Nonetheless, it is sort of a gradual, you might say, map of where there's interaction, where the interaction gets less, where people perhaps have never seen the sea and think like these people in these cities must be very strange or so. I had another example. Oh yeah, for example, I tried to map out the spread of production of beer and consumption of beer, and it's quite telling. That actually sort of shows you beer is produced in Istanbul, in Salonika, a little bit in Izmir, a little bit in Beirut, and then a few port cities have like their local breweries. You'll find people drinking on the Aegean Islands. You'll find them drinking in the Balkans, some places. You won't find beer being much of an issue if you go into Malatya or Diyarbakir or so. So that's where I must say, yes, these, but it's a very complicated picture. It's a very layered picture. So I hesitate to just say like it's the hinterland and the city, if you get what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from David Sipanyuk. First, he says, very informative discussion, thank you. In your research, did you come across any correlation between the growth of port cities and the integration and or acceptance of minorities?
Yeah, well, to be honest, in the first review of this book, which has been published by Ethem Eldem, besides saying a lot of very nice things about my book, he does sort of call me out for not having gone into quantifications all too much, except that section on beer consumption and production I just mentioned. So to be honest, I can't say anything too clear about correlations between growth and acceptance. It is an interesting question because one thing I try to point out is that if you look at like Greeks of Izmir in say 1830 or Greeks of Izmir 1900, you don't just have the residents multiplying, having kids, and the population growing that way. Actually, the Greeks of Izmir in, say, this period closer to the Balkan Wars are rather different. There'll be a lot of people who will have migrated out of other regions of Asia Minor for economic purposes, or they might also be Greeks resettling from Athens. So these boxes, Turks of Salonika, what have you, Armenians of Istanbul, they are in constant flux. So that is a question. If I can spot a trend in general in this very long 19th century I've been looking at, I'd say it is, you might say, a bit of a bifurcation. At the beginning of the 19th century, I've found people very frankly criticizing their home cultures or criticizing the culture they grew out of. people of Izmir say like, oh, these Greek dances, forget about them. It's horrible. They're horrible. Let's teach people proper operetta and how to dance the waltz and so on. You won't be so likely to find that in 1910. You find actually that this phenomena like this cross-naming, which I tried to mention, that is a very late development. Or I found some people writing openly in the Journal de Salonique. I don't want to sort of have to apologize for my French, which is obviously Levantine and not perfect Parisian French, but why can't Levantine French be just another dialect of French, just as people from Provence won't be expected to speak perfect Parisian either? So you have this trend towards people actually identifying more strongly with sort of their hybrid identities, if you so will. But on the other hand, you obviously have Enver Pasha, Halide Edip. You have these characters of the forming nationalist movement who are ready to say, like, I don't want my kids to come home from or to like learn from their nannies to say maman. I want them to speak proper Turkish, then to learn French. So that is sort of the split I see as characteristic of the eve of the 20th century, and perhaps once again a sort of reflection of what we have today, actually more a split into two camps, to people who see cosmopolitan identity as something positive and a radical group which want to combat it.
Okay, thank you. I've got a follow-up question. Thinking about these societies, the societies in these cities, were they perhaps less stratified by class than their equivalents in Europe? And, you know, because of either the multinationality or just because they were very mercantilistic cities?
I found actually, to me, it seemed like there were large class differences. Like we tend to often deal with the middle classes, the merchants, because they figure prominently, of course, in writing about the 19th century. But we have to think there are people out there who carry stuff back and forth onto the ships on their backs, the hamals, the porters of the quays. There are people in the factories processing, say, figs to dry them so they are shippable to Europe. We have, and that's an interesting phenomenon, we have actually these incoming musicians who are often from places like Habsburg, Galicia, so nowadays Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, where living conditions, even though it's officially Austria, living conditions are pretty abominable. And they're like, okay, let's go on the road, play the violin in these bars, even if we have to play 8 hours a day and don't earn too much money. Better than hanging around in stagnant Eastern Habsburg Empire. So I would say we should think of these societies actually as rather divided both by class and by these different language registers and the like.
Okay, thank you. Helen Icolina.
Yes, I have unmuted myself. Thank you very much. I really found your, talk very interesting, particularly the illustrations you used as well. And as a woman, I was really fascinated by the group of women and their boys, their children, drinking beer. So do you have, were they Muslim? In terms of ethnicity, were they Muslim? Were they Greek, Armenian? I think that was a beer garden in Istanbul, wasn't it?
Thank you. Yes, I love that picture too.
And the boys seem to be drinking too, actually. They had, you know, a glass, a beer mug in front of them. Yes.
All these, like, except for the very young girls and the very old woman, I think they all have a glass of beer in front of them. Sorry, where was it? I'll go back to sharing my screen again, just so everybody can recall that picture. Just a sec. Here they are. All right.
Yes,
All right. So yeah, I've mused about this picture a while. I have no idea where it actually comes from, because this was from an exhibition by Tarih Vakfı on the history of beer in Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, which was based just on people donating pictures, and the donations were not documented in any ways. Most likely, the #1 beer garden of Istanbul, which was very popular, was the Bomonti Beer Garden, close to where you have the remnants of that factory, or part of that factory nowadays. So possibly there, but could be somewhere else completely. I have no idea. I found that these rather scanty headscarves most of these women are wearing, they appeared in a newspaper advertising fashion around 1918. And to have something like where you have hair sticking out on all ends, I think like you wouldn't have had that much before the World War, sometime around then. You see the one woman who is apparently dressed in chadr. I've had all kinds of opinions by people on this. Some saying it could also be a Jewish family. Some people saying it could also be Christian Orthodox.
Yeah.
I'm not really an expert on dress, so it's hard to say. But these head coverings is when were popular among Muslim women around 1918. That's about as much as I can say.
Well, that's interesting, because I thought it was I should have looked at the fashion, as you say, the dresses. I thought for a while that it was the late 19th century and not early 20th century. And, you know, would you know what class, whether they would be the type of women who went to one of the foreign language schools, like the French one, or there was an Austrian one, you know, there were all sorts of schools, because that was what I think was very important in Turkey in terms of class, whether you spoke another language, like French.
Yeah. I guess if somebody could help us out, who can place the dress more specifically, we could learn more. My guesses are also just wild off then. This beer garden doesn't strike me as like particularly upper class, if I'd say so. The table and the setting doesn't seem to me like this is some kind of elite. I'd say it's more a middle class phenomenon. Like fairly ordinary people could go to Bomonti Beer Garden, for example. I found, thanks to my colleague Florian Riedler, a passage where an Armenian baker apprentice actually went with his colleagues there to have a beer. Beer wasn't like an elite phenomenon. You definitely find it in different segments of society. It was more like a cultural thing to say, like, either, oh, we are Ottomans have always drunk raki, shouldn't drink anything but raki, or people saying, oh yeah, well, if people drink this in Munich, why not? Let's taste it. I'm open for things. Yeah, I like European stuff. Why not try this?
Yeah, it's a statement about being modern, basically, I think.
Modern, plus one should recall, it's actually in this period of time, a lot of going out places are still very much for men. So to have a family gathering without an adult male at the table like this is probably something you couldn't do in the Kaffeehane, you couldn't do it in the Meihane. So that it is also another form of sociability which is enabled here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any last questions? Because as our time is nearly up. If not, Malte, would you like to just say something about your current research? And are there any sort of sources of information you're looking for? Is there anything which the Levantine Heritage Foundation and the audience here or our network could help with?
Thank you. Well, what I'm working on now is something. I think it's easiest to start with an anecdote. Like in 2013, when the municipality of Ankara was bulldozing a large street through the forested campus of some of Ankara's universities, and people were protesting against this. Recep Tayyip Erdogan went up in front of the cameras and said, like, oh, I'd do anything for a road. I'd knock down a mosque, and because roads are civilization, yol medeniyetir. And I'm trying to sort of go for the history of this concept, this idea that in order to bring progress, you identify progress with traffic infrastructure, and you're ready to to move away the people in your path on the claim that you are bringing a better future to the country with more roads or railways or airports or whatever you have. And from what I've been seeing so far, this is an idea which at least goes back to the Tanzimat, the idea that infrastructure, railways, highways, not to forget, would be of such great benefit that it would warrant violence and also bringing to the people all kinds of things, corvée, special taxes, and the like. So I've been looking at that. So I'm very open for anything on road construction as can be any time, say sort of since the 1830s until say 1950s, 1960 perhaps is sort of the limit of what I'm looking at. Most especially railways play a big role, of course. The big railway projects of the Ottoman Empire, later of the Republic as well, and any kind of material related to that. And in addition, especially like views of people who are confronted by this, who criticize this, who perhaps refuse to work as corvée laborers on these construction sites, or who write like, oh, I don't think our politicians will ever manage to finish that road. They haven't done that since, I don't know, 1856, and I'm writing in the year 1863, and I don't think I'll ever see these roads finished. Anything like that is kind of interesting to me. If somebody knows some sources for that, I'd be very happy. Thank you.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you for that. And if anyone does have any information for Malte, we would be very happy to connect you to him. Just email Craig Enser and myself at contact@levantineheritage.com, and we'd be happy to put you together. I think that brings us to the end of our evening. Firstly, thank you so much, Dr. Malte Fuhrmann, for your talk. We enjoyed it very much, and thank you all for the discussion. Thank you for attending and listening, and we very much look forward to seeing you again in about a month's time. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.